Welcome to Wild Places. I'm your host, Brad Clement. This podcast is presented by Panji Foundation, saving snow leopards, helping communities. Eric Lillstrom joins us today. Eric, super excited to have you here. I don't know of many people who essentially make their living in and on the North Pole. So you're a guide. You guide expeditions in polar regions. How many times have you been to the North Pole?
I've been to the North Pole a handful of times. My first time there was in April of 2014. I've gone almost every year since, with the exception of the last couple of years. I feel like I've forgotten what it's like because we just haven't been able to go for the last 2 years. But so I think I've stood at the North Pole probably 5 or 6 separate times, sometimes multiple times in 1 year, but it never feels like the same place.
Yeah. Well, and is it the same place? I mean, what is the North Pole? It's essentially frozen ocean.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. It's, obviously you're in the same spot geographically when you reach 90 degrees north, or the geographic North Pole. But what you see when you get there is just whatever frozen ocean happens to be floating across the North Pole at that moment. And when I say moment, that can really be just 1 second. You find 90 degrees north on your GPS, you're right there, and then a few seconds later you have floated past it, and you have to go back and find it again because that ice is in constant motion.
So that I would love to later on get into the fact that I would think you start at point A, you end at point B being the North Pole.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a straight line. You go there and that's all it is. But really, I guess it's not. I mean, the ocean is moving, currents are in play. So you're moving on this frozen water while you're trying to get to this magnetic GPS point.
Yeah.
But it's, in general, correct me if I'm wrong, it's not easy just to get to where you're going to start the expedition. There are a lot of logistics. How do you get there?
There are a few ways. The most common way is probably just by helicopter. So the reason why most people visit during the month of April is because that's when those logistics that you mentioned are really in place to allow for a good number of people each year to visit the North Pole. And that's because there is a base camp that's built on the ice somewhere within the last degree of latitude, so within 60 nautical miles of the North Pole, that they plow a runway on the ice for this, one specialized jet to come land on. And then from there, people will get in a helicopter and go to the North Pole, fly directly there, hop out and visit, and then fly back. So first of all, you have to get to Svalbard, which is an archipelago of islands north of Norway in the Arctic Ocean, which you can reach by a normal commercial flight. And from there, you take about a 2-hour flight on a specialized Russian transport jet to the Borneo ice camp and land, which is built there on the ice. And then from there, take a helicopter to the North Pole, or in our case, take a helicopter to your expedition starting point, and then be airlifted out by helicopter afterwards.
Nice. So you keep mentioning things like, there's a runway plowed on the ice. There's a base camp situated and built on the ice. And you also mentioned the month of April. Mm-hmm. So how is this ice permanent? Does it come and go with the seasons? And how thick is the ice?
The ice thickness varies a lot. It's really only viable in April because the sun has just risen on the Arctic after a long polar winter. And so the ice is at its greatest extent. As that ocean freezes around the edges of this vast ice sheet floating on the Arctic Ocean, it can be relatively thin because that ice freezes and thaws every year. what we look for, or what the logistics company looks for when building the base camp, is some good, stable, what we call multi-year ice, which doesn't thaw during the summertime. And so that ice can be anywhere from 3 meters to 15 meters thick at the very thickest. But most of the time, it's just a large, stable pan of ice that's been around for a few years. And when you're that close to the North Pole, you have a lot better luck at finding a stable piece of ice to build a runway on. So that's why we go in April. The climate has just become livable. The sun is up, so you're not experiencing minus 60-degree temperatures. You're experiencing anywhere from 0 to minus 30 or 40 at the coldest. And like I said, that ice is basically at its most stable point for expeditions to happen.
So you're pretty casual about 0 to minus 30, 40. How many days are you experiencing minus 30, minus 40? And for our listeners, at a certain point, actually at minus 40 Celsius and Fahrenheit, agree with each other. So we're talking really cold.
And I usually work in Celsius for expeditions, but minus 40 would be a very cold day at the North Pole. It's not unheard of, but it's not the rule. I'd say more often, talking in Fahrenheit, you're looking at 10 degrees on the warm side to minus 10, minus 20. But it's a very different kind of cold than you may have experienced other places, such as high altitude mountaineering, or it's a very humid cold. The humidity is around 80% because you're right there at sea level. And so wherever there's open water, it's just pumping moisture into the air. And you're also not getting any heat from the sun. It's about 10 degrees off the horizon and just runs around the horizon once a day. So you're not getting any warmth from the sun. And it's that kind of damp, penetrating cold. So if you'd ask me, I think the North Pole feels a lot colder than somewhere that is colder on a thermometer, like Antarctica or Greenland can be. But those are a much, much drier cold, and you get more sunlight.
Yeah, I love the way you mentioned humidity, and I believe we both grew up in the Midwest, so I know like humidity makes it even more cold. Then you're talking about no sun, no thermal penetration from the sun. So given those factors, what made you end up being a polar guide? How did you fall into this?
I did just fall into it, really. So the company that I work for is called Polar Explorers. We're based out of the North Chicago area, and we have a sister company that does sea kayaking adventures all across the world, but also some locally there in the Great Lakes and the Midwest. And that's actually where I began, because I had a background in aquatic sports, canoeing and kayaking, and I was involved in a lot of outdoor activities as a kid. And so, let's see, I think I was probably 22 or 23 years old and was unhappy with my office job and found this company. Started on part-time doing kayaking lessons, and then worked my way up through that, guiding some sea kayaking adventures. Not hardcore by any means, in the Greek islands and the Mediterranean and that sort of thing. But then I was introduced to Polar Explorers through that company, the Northwest Passage, and I volunteered to be a grunt on one of our polar shakedown trainings in northern Minnesota. And I was already skilled at cross-country skiing and had done some cold weather camping as a kid and took to it really well. And when a spot opened up to work for Polar Explorers, I jumped on it. And that's where I've been for the last 7 years.
That's great. If you could just come up with one experience that has really stuck with you is there any one moment that you just think of that summarizes your time on the North Pole?
That is a really good question, and I don't think it's one that I've been asked before. Um, the North Pole, it's it's different from a lot of other what you might think are similar, uh, expedition locations, because there's no route. Like, it's very, you wake up in the morning and you don't know what type of terrain is ahead of you. It could be flat, you know, perfect ice, and you'll make really great time. Or you could be in for miles of impassable ice rubble, or like open water leads that you can't get around. Um, and I think one experience in particular that kind of highlighted the uncertain nature of it is was in 2017, when I think it was our second night on the ice, doing skiing the last degree of latitude to the North Pole. We were making dinner. We had our group of tents set up, and had not yet set up our polar bear fence around the camp. But I was sitting in the vestibule of the tent cooking appetizers for dinner. I think it was bacon and cheese quesadillas. And I heard my co-guide, Annie, unzip her tent door. And I just hear her yell, "Bear, bear, bear." And I leapt up and unzipped the tent door, and 15 yards away was a polar bear standing looking at our camp. And so luckily we were able to scare it away without, everyone was able to walk away from that expedition, hopefully a little wiser and unharmed. But that's the only time that I've seen a polar bear. And it's actually really uncommon to encounter them on the sea ice. But I do come back to that experience a lot when thinking about kind of just how random and uncertain every hour that you have on the sea ice can be.
So when you agree to guide these trips, you're dealing a lot with a friendship, a relationship with the unknown.
Yeah, you could say that.
And are you comfortable there? I would assume the answer is yes.
Well, comfort is relative, I guess, but I would say that I don't know that I'm comfortable with it, but it is something that keeps me coming back every time. I've climbed some mountains, and I'm not an excellent mountaineer by any means, but you go to the top and you come down, and then when you climb the same mountain over and over, at least for me, it loses a little bit of its luster, it loses a little bit of the appeal. And with the North Pole, because you don't know what each day is going to look like, it's like a new expedition every time. And so while my comfort level with it is debatable day to day, I would say that it's definitely exciting.
That's cool. So I know myself, through 20 years of being a mountain guide, there are some expeditions where it's stressful. Like, every day you have so many moving parts, so many things to consider, where it's really almost overwhelming. And yet I find myself enjoying those moments as well. Do you, as a polar guide, do you experience that same thing, where you have people relying on you? You have conditions that you don't have every answer for, but at the same time, you're going to be okay. And I don't know where that comes from, but it happens.
Yeah. I definitely feel similarly. It's I find myself being the most stressed during the whole guiding process before taking the first step on the trail. So once you have your bag packed or your sled packed and the helicopter flies away, that's when everything settles down. That's when the goal becomes clear, and all of the little problems that will happen along the way kind of work themselves out. But the whole, making sure all of the luggage is on the airplane, making sure that everybody has all of the right things, that I think is a more stressful part for me. Once it's just you and your team on the ice, that's a very comfortable place.
And what does that look like when the helicopter leaves? It's just your team. You have this goal for a magnetic point in the world. And what are you looking at? How heavy are the sleds? Do you have anything on your back? And are you walking? Are you skiing? How does this whole setup work?
Sure. So the sleds vary. You're carrying all of your own personal gear plus a portion of the group equipment. So looking at probably 60 to 80 pounds on average, anywhere up to 100, 150 pounds for a 10-day expedition. And some people will wear a small backpack, but I don't prefer it, because especially in that humid cold, it just is another thing to collect sweat. But we use these harnesses that are basically like just a backpack, shoulder straps, and waist belt, and then your sled clips onto that by way of like a 10-foot long rope behind you. And we do use skis, backcountry, cross-country skis. While there's no real elevation gain and loss, we just use them for efficiency of travel. So you're staying on top of the snow. There's a small skin for traction on the bottom. We found that that's by far the most efficient way to travel. You're split up into groups of 3. So that's what we call our pods. Each group of 3 is completely self-sufficient. In case we were to get separated by an open lead of water or something, your team could feasibly, set up their tent and have food and be just fine until we were able to get back together. But that's not something that really happens.
Yeah. And let's go back to, okay, so we're skiing, we have these sleds, and yet you are on an active, moving ocean.
Mm-hmm.
Just riding on the ice on top of the ocean. So do you ever have days where beautiful weather or whatever it may be, you think you're going to make great time and get further in the route, and in reality maybe you lose some ground because of the way the ocean currents work?
Yeah, those are bad days. No matter how good the weather is, if you're not making progress in a day, that's a pretty bad day. Before getting dropped off, we have a pretty good sense of the trend of ice movement over the last month or whatever. And there are factors that can help predict, what direction ice is going to be moving and how active that will be. So we're not going in totally blind. But occasionally you'll find yourself on the polar treadmill, as we call it, and you're you can generally you can always ski faster than the ice is moving, if there are good conditions in front of you, good sea ice conditions. But if you are getting some what we call negative drift, then when you set up camp at night, you look at your GPS and then you clock it and wake up and look at it again and see how far you've drifted back. Mm-hmm. So what we prefer is when you wake up in the morning, you look at your GPS and you're, a couple miles closer to the pole. So that's just miles that you don't have to ski. So
how many days in any given trip do you get the benefit of the current versus the negativity of the current?
I'd say more often than not, we set ourselves up to get the positive drift.
Nice.
I like to use the analogy for ice pack movement as if you imagine some Cheerios on floating on in a bowl of milk, and if you blew on them, they would all slowly move across to the other side and stack up against each other. And that's a very simplistic explanation of what happens with the sea ice. So when you have big systems of weather move across, it's going to take some time to start moving that ice, and then it'll move, and start to stack up against each other. So one of the harder conditions to encounter is when you have a good drift trend going, and then you get a storm front that comes in and pushes against it, because that's when all of those, tens upon thousands, hundreds of thousands of individual pans of ice will start to separate. And that can get kind of dicey when it comes to finding your way from pan to pan.
So do you find yourself navigating, let's say you're going north to south, just for an example, and do you find yourself having to navigate east and west just to find a good connection of these plates of ice? Almost like, for me, the analogy would be going through a crevasse field on a mountain where you're trying to go straight, but you really have to go sideways, backwards, forwards a lot to kind of figure out the maze.
Yeah, that's a very apt comparison. Cracks in the ice between pans are very much like crevasses, only you can see the water right there. It's not an unknown distance to drop down. The consequences of falling in the water are much less than falling in a crevasse. But we find ourselves very often zigzagging right, left, even if you're drifting north and a little bit east, you can set, what we would call in kayaking or any kind of boating, it's called a ferry angle, where if you know you're getting pushed one way and you want to take the shortest line to a point, you have to kind of adjust off course a little bit so that you're getting pushed directly where you want to go.
So there's definite strategy involved, and
absolutely, especially the closer that you get to the North Pole, because when you're 60 nautical miles away, you don't see your margin of error is a lot more forgiving. When you get within a couple miles of the North Pole and you're drifting quickly, you get one good chance to get ahead of the North Pole and drift onto it or hit it right on, because you might take one route that is a little circuitous, and then the North Pole, like, you drift past, and then you find yourself on that treadmill trying to catch back up to the North Pole again. So it's
a bit of a chess game.
It is, and it's one of the most fun parts of being a guide on the North Pole.
Yeah. So we talk about, you mentioned leads, open leads, and is that open water? And how often do you encounter these? And what does happen if someone falls in the water?
We encounter open water leads or freshly frozen leads. A lead is basically just a stretch between established pans of ice. So you might encounter a lead that is, a few inches thick of ice, or even a foot thick, and very stable to travel on. But we encounter leads, multiple times daily, usually. Hopefully they are small, ideally just a couple feet or a couple inches, or frozen enough that you can just keep on going right over them. The opposite of those is pressure ridges, and I guess we can talk about pressure ridges in a second, but occasionally you will get to some complicated parts where you are trying to get across a larger lead by kind of linking up smaller pieces of ice to get across. And falling in is not common. I think that the guides fall in maybe up to their ankle or up to their knee most often, while maybe testing out some potential ice for crossing, or testing out what is in actuality some pretty soft ice, but looks okay to travel on. But if someone was to fall in up to their neck and get fully soaked through all the layers, we would just get that person out with a throw rope or whatever. And then ideally you start skiing again immediately to get that blood pumping and kind of develop that heat. Stop, set up a tent, strip off all the clothes, get some hot drinks, get into dry clothes, and then keep skiing immediately again. Mm-hmm. Get dry and keep the body moving.
So the opposite of leads are pressure ridges. And again, I'm a layman in all of this, but that's where the ice pushes against itself to two plates or multiple plates and creates ridges.
Yeah. It's basically, these are one of the things that you can sometimes actually experience in action, because obviously when you're on a pan of ice, you might be you're always drifting, but you can't feel that you're moving. It's like being on a really large ship, essentially, that's moving very slowly. But in a zone that's actively, that's active and making a pressure ridge, you'll sometimes actually see it or hear the ice cracking and groaning, and you can see this ridge forming and getting pushed up, kind of like plate tectonics in miniature. And anywhere where there's a zone that's active, we wouldn't try and cross a ridge like that, because you're playing with these chunks of ice that are thousands of pounds, and if they're constantly moving, it's just too risky. But we will come up to pressure ridges that are constant, that are old and fixed in place, and then it's just a matter of is it going to be more work to cross this 15 or 20 foot ridge of ice, or and get all of our sleds over and take off our skis and kind of shuttle everything across, or is it going to be more efficient to just ski along it and wait for an easier spot to cross?
How many hours a day are you skiing and moving?
We usually moving about 8 hours a day.
So for you as a guide, you're talking about all of these variables. There are a lot of moving parts, quite literally. And 8 hours with clients,
mm-hmm.
a lot of weight on a sled. You're tremendously engaged mentally throughout this process.
Yeah, and I'll come back to that being one of the reasons why it's my favorite place to guide, because you are completely engaged. On some other expeditions where you're just crossing a large ice cap, like in Antarctica or Greenland, you can just throw in an audiobook and kind of check out and ski for 8 hours. But as a guide, especially, you're constantly evaluating, okay, am I going to go this way? You're constantly making choices in a choose your own adventure book, basically. And sometimes the choices pan out, sometimes they don't. But knowing that there are polar bears around, knowing that that I don't want to say that the other team members become kind of secondary, because we take very good care of our team members, but there's just so much more to think about that the days go by pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's nice. So you're a new dad. This is the first time dad we're speaking with today.
Yeah, she's 3 weeks old.
3 weeks old. So wow. And do you think being a father now is that going to fit with your lifestyle of being away and guiding and I mean, I think of all the time before I got married, I
Mhm.
was literally spending 6 to 9 months every year in a tent on some steep slope somewhere.
Yeah.
And how do you feel about becoming a dad and how this affects you kind of your lifestyle and livelihood?
I'm first of all, I could not be more excited to be a dad. Uh, I know it's something I've known that I've wanted for a long time, and it will definitely impact how much I enjoy the times that I'm away. I think, um, for example, like we have North Pole expeditions coming up this April, where I'll normally I would try to negotiate not being gone quite as long. Um, but I'll have to be gone for a month when she's 3 months old, and I'm not excited for that. Um, but it's kind of unavoidable.
Yeah, yeah. So if these trips are in April, and I know you do another guiding, other work for this company throughout every year, do you find yourself like really looking forward to April and kind of getting excited?
Yeah, definitely. It's what we plan for every year. We have other expeditions, but the North Pole is, I think it's the thing that we're all most passionate about. Um, and so it really is the culmination of our year, each year. And so this last year with the pandemic, we weren't able to travel, and in 2019 the expeditions were canceled for a totally different reason, which had never happened in the entire history of uh, the Borneo base camp. So we're looking at 2 years running now where we haven't been able to set foot on the sea ice, and everybody is very, very eager to do it.
Yeah, yeah. Is there a website or is there a place where people can find out more about you and the company you work with? Anything to mention on those?
Yeah, polarexplorers.com. You'll find all of our expeditions and details. Um, emailing Polar Explorers, you'll find gets you to me directly, or you can look me up, ericlillstrom.com, or just on social media, which I still do, but I'm less and less enthused about.
Gotcha, gotcha. Eric, I can't thank you enough for being a guest today. It's been fantastic. I find this a fascinating place in the world, and really one of the last truly remote, ever changing uh, locales that humans can still travel to. So
Yeah,
huge thanks for joining
I'm
us. And
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and I couldn't agree more. It's unlike any other place in the world.
all right, thanks, man.